Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Joe Grzywacz, thank you so much for joining us today on Meaningful Work Matters. It is a pleasure to be able to have you on this podcast, talking today about probably a whole bunch of different questions that relate to, in many ways, some of the hardcore science that is happening around the topic of work. Maybe we can just start by you introducing yourself briefly and telling us a little bit about your connection to research on work.
Good morning, Andrew. It's really great for me to be here. I'm thrilled that you invited me to come, and I'm really thrilled to be able to talk about this. My name is Joe Grzywacz, as you pointed out. I'm way over on the other side of the southern part of the North American continent. I'm in California at San Jose State University. I am an associate dean of research and faculty development here in the College of Health and Human Sciences, and I've been studying sort of everyday work and family life and its implications for health and well-being now for almost 25 years. I think I started when I was 4, so that makes me, a young man and have a long way to go.
Tell us what makes your work meaningful.
So what makes my work meaningful? Probably the same thing of many scientists, right? That is, we tend to do me search. We try to understand the things that we're experiencing, the things that we understand, and the things that we're trying to figure out. And so I first started studying work and family, like I said, about 25 years ago. I was working in worksite health promotion. My job was try to get people to exercise, eat right, stop smoking, and all those other kinds of things. And when I talked to people, they said, well, Joe, I hate my job. Why would I spend any more time going to the fitness center? Or why should I care about whether or not my healthcare costs are high? Because, they're just stealing money from me and not paying my real wages anyway. So why should I bother? And at the time, when I was young and naive, I was like, oh, you're just being selfish. But the more I thought about it and the more I experienced it myself as I was going through life, the more I realized that in some ways work can be set up to be a bit of a challenge for people to get through. And that, in fact, sometimes work can actually be a place to help people flourish and do well also. But it comes down to being able to design that appropriately and make sure that we have the right people at the table. So I've been studying that for a long time, trying to make the world a better place for myself, my kids, my students, and all that kind of stuff. And we'll see if it works out in the long run.
You're certainly singing my tune. Firm believer that work can be designed, that we have a tremendous opportunity to control so many different factors in the workplace, and also just even the way that we think about work in so many different ways. So often way more intentionality and design can go into any of those things than most of us give ourselves credit for.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
In our article on meaningful work that set off this whole podcast series, Carol Riff and I, we tried to pull out a whole bunch of research that was on the topic of work that had come out of this truly landmark study that Carol has been leading for decades now. That's called the Midlife in the U.S. study, or MIDUS for short. And I know that you've been involved in a bunch of that research. We certainly cite some of that research in the article. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about MIDUS and kind of what it is, what it tries to do, how you got involved.
MIDUS, as you say, the Midlife and Development Study has been going on now for, I think it's almost 30 years. I was first introduced to it when I was looking for a graduate program. At the time, it was funded by the MacArthur Foundation, and the goal was to understand successful aging. It's now been repeated and followed up now for, as I say, for 30 years. It's now funded by the National Institutes on Aging. It's one of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health. And the area that I'm responsible for in the Midas project is all things pertaining to work. So I oversee part of the sets of the questionnaires that talk about how we evaluate different aspects of work. We bring different work-related measures into the Midas study, all with the goal of recognizing that the usual person spends more time at work than just about any place else throughout the course of their life. And so therefore, it has profound potential to shape the health and well-being of individuals across the lifespan.
Many of the people who are going to be listening to this podcast are not researchers. They're not scientists. Even the practitioners who might know something about the science of work probably don't know all that much about Midas. And I actually think that this study is an incredibly important study for a few different reasons. First and foremost, just its longitudinal nature. So you talked about it being a 30-year strong study, so tracking people over the course of truly their lifetime. And the other thing that I think that Midas does, it's very different than much other psychological research. Is that it's concretely looking at biomarkers and other kind of social determinants of health, as well as various attributes of psychological health and wellness. Can you just say anything about those two things, and or just what else do you think separates Midas from other studies out there?
After spending 30 years in it, a person can kind of forget what really makes it unique and valuable. And one of the things that makes it unique and valuable is in the 90s, when it was first started, it was one of the first studies to try to do things across different disciplines. So at the time, we had things like the National Health Interview Survey, which was all about measuring physical activity and smoking and those kinds of things. But there wasn't anything social in it or anything psychological in it. Likewise, there was lots of national studies of psychological things, like the psychology of aging or the economics of aging and retirement with the health and retirement study. But at the time, there wasn't anything that tried to bring the social world, think like social, socioeconomic status, think race and ethnicity, think the structure of aging and how people are treated differently at different points in the life course, along with psychology and how people think about themselves and interrelate with one another, as well as the biology of what's connected with those. At the time, there wasn't anything like that. And so the Midas really brought a lot of interdisciplinary work together and in some ways birthed a whole new way of thinking about how we do integrative science. And that's part of the reason why it's been funded by the National Institutes on Aging now for over 30 years. Now, with regard to sort of the social determinants part, from the very beginning, the Midas was originally designed to understand why is it that some people age well and other people don't age well? And the original questions were along the lines of, how come women live longer than men? Why is it that poor people tend to get diseases more often or more frequently or more intensively than do rich people? How is it that education and advanced education somehow seems to convey a beneficial effect for health-related outcomes? Why do Black people tend to die sooner than white people? So when we talk about social determinants, these are the kinds of questions that the Midas was originally designed to answer. And it's been working on trying to answer those questions now for 30 years. And again, it was one of the first ones to try to bring psychology and biology and sociology and economics all together in one place so that we were kind of looking at the whole elephant, if you follow that metaphor.
When it comes to the topic of work, are there specific areas that you think are just really interesting that we should kind of talk through today?
Andrew, we could talk about that for like days, I'm sure. but to me, where we are in modern society, I really think that there's at least 2 or 3 points about work, that command attention. Right. It's crystal clear that, that in after, 100 years of a capitalist economy and turning individuals into workers and consumers into workers, and really making it difficult to find meaning in work. To pick up on some of your terms, just the way we think about work and act about work and what work means in society is incredibly important. And then, of course, it's interconnected with our economy and and the way that we live our lives outside of our work life. And so I think how we think about work, how we structure work, and how we consume and approach the work that we do, why we do that work, are all incredibly important topics for helping us understand adult health and well-being.
If we start about job characteristics, like what about the actual design of work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. As you probably know, or some of your listeners probably know, there's a lot of ways of thinking about work. One way of doing that is what the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health refers to as the overall organization of work. That is, how is work done and managed? And within that are the elements that you talked about, those job characteristics. And as you might expect, there's tons of scientific theories on those elements. But when you boil all those theories down, we're really only talking about a handful of major ideas. One of those ideas is essentially, what are the opportunities people have on their job to actually exercise some kind of control or say or decision making regarding the kind of work that they do? And again, you can think about this in kind of simplistic terms, right? Back in the early industrial age, there was the people who were working on the industrial lines, putting pins into widgets or putting cogs into clocks or whatever it is that was being manufactured. And that's all that they did all day long, was putting in this pin, putting in that pin, and that sort of thing. And then there was another group of people who perhaps, oversaw that work. The point is that there wasn't much decision making, going on in that particular activity. And some would characterize that as being a way of kind of dehumanizing what some of the work is. So one of those elements is sort of this idea of control or decision making. Another element about work, and it's called different things in different theories, is sort of this idea of how much external pressure or demand is put upon you. And again, you can kind of think about that production worker, but even in today's economy, if you think about the gig workers, right? The Uber drivers or the people who are doing meal delivery and that kind of thing, their wages really fundamentally depend on how many deliveries they can make, or how fast the production line is going, or how many widgets can actually get made at the end of the day. That external pressure in terms of being able to identify and produce without any control is another element of jobs that we know are fairly important for being able to understand health and well-being. A third part of jobs that oftentimes come into place in these characteristics that you're talking about, after we talk about how much say or control you have and how much external demand or pressure is put upon you, is then when we start getting into more of the psychology of the work, and that is what I'm doing meaningful? Doesn't matter anyplace else. Okay, I'm making clocks, but does the world care about clocks? Because everybody now has an iPhone, and it really doesn't matter whether or not they've got clocks in their world. So this idea that what you do matters in some sort of a lasting way is also an important element of being able to think about the health and well-being of individuals. And then the last one is sort of this idea of, am I treated fairly, equitably? And again, you can think about that in terms of all sorts of different things, whether it's how much money you get paid, right? Am I paid what I'm worth kind of thing? You can think about it in terms of how I'm treated on the job as opposed to other people, even if we're making the same amount of money. But if the boss has his or her favorites, or if my job is not appreciated as much as somebody else's job, that creates this sense of, well, what's wrong with me? What is it about me or the things that I'm doing, or what is so special about those other individuals that can really create some difficulties? And all of these really come out to play in aspects of racial inequalities when we come to understand health. The data is really quite clear. People who are Black and brown, for example, are more likely to find dangerous things on their jobs or to be doing dangerous work, right? Think about the people who are building buildings and falling from skyscrapers as they're building them. Those tend to be Black and brown individuals. Think about the individuals who are cleaning toilets or mucking out stalls in factory barns and that kind of thing. Those tend to be Black and brown individuals. Of course, not exclusively, right? That's not the point. But if we were going to break it down in terms of 100 people, the majority of those are going to be Black and brown individuals. And then likewise, when we move into more of the psychological space, right? Do you have a control over the decisions that you're doing or the kind of work that you do? Well, I've spent 20 years, studying immigrant farm workers, and there's only so many ways that you can harvest crops, right? When you're harvesting tomatoes by hand, you just go in with a bucket and you pull them off as fast as you can. You get your ticket for a bucket of tomatoes, and then you go back and you keep doing it. So oftentimes the jobs that Black and brown folks have are limiting in terms of the amount of say and control that they have. Likewise with the kinds of interactions, and likewise with sort of the sense of purpose behind all of this. So you can begin to see how is it that this idea of the basic job characteristics are oftentimes very different for Black and brown individuals, but as well as for young workers as opposed to older workers, and for women as opposed to men, right? The job market is segregated in lots of ways that tend to benefit some people and not others.
Super clear. Thank you so much, Joe, for being able to articulate a lot of complexity in a way that is actually quite accessible. So thank you for that. These aspects of, do I have a sense of control? What are the kinds of demands that are placed on me? Is my work meaningful? Is my work fair? What kind of impact do those things have on somebody's psychological well-being?
Well, we know that those elements for now at least probably 40 to 50 years worth of research has substantial consequences for a variety of psychological outcomes. So think things like levels of depression, think levels of anxiety. There's some people who would argue today that, that the level of anxiety that we're seeing in the current labor market is in part a function of a lot of stripping away of some of this control and meaning and the imposition of external demands on individuals. So at least in the psychological space, and if we're looking at quote unquote psychiatric kinds of things, we see it showing up in a wide variety of different places. But beyond that, we also see it showing up in other places. So for example, there's this really, wonderful scientific theory called cognitive reserve, right? Think of your mind as though it's a muscle. And if you think of your mind as a muscle, this idea that the more you exercise it, the better it is going to work, and the longer it's going to last, it's going to stay robust and healthy for a longer period of time. Well, likewise, many of these job characteristics have been linked with things like, how well your cognitive functioning holds on into later life, as an example, using that metaphor of cognitive reserve and your mind is a mental muscle. Correspondingly then, and I'm not sure if your questions are going to be going in that direction, but it also then plays out in terms of different aspects of physical health, right? Think
This is my next question.
Think cardiovascular disease. It's been linked with a variety of these of the outcomes that most people are concerned about in terms of chronic disease. So it's pretty clear that work does underlie our health and well-being. It just takes a while for it to catch up with us, it would seem.
I want to shift now to the question of the relationship between work and the rest of our lives. So there's this kind of fancy term that you've got called work-family interface that seems to be very dominant within the Midas literature and other scientific literature on work. Can you just tell us about what that means?
Just about every year, especially in the southern climates, we hear a tragic story of one type or another, where a parent is so fixated on getting themselves going through their routine, getting ready for their day, getting their kids off to work, that invariably a mom or a dad goes into sort of automatic pilot and they go straight to work, forgetting that their child fell asleep in the back of their car. That's what we mean when we talk about the work-family interface, right? Those kinds of experiences where we are in two spaces at the same time. I'm getting ready, I'm going to work, I'm on sort of my automatic pilot because my mind is getting ready for the day. But because my child has fallen asleep, perhaps I've forgotten the responsibilities of my child and my family members. That's the essence of the work-family interface. That is, we are one individual, but we are called to do two incredibly important tasks. We are called to be loved ones to our partners and to care for our children. But yet, to survive in today's economy, we also have to be a worker. And so therefore, our minds and our time and our ability to be able to do both of those things is oftentimes required to be split or to be broken apart in some way, shape, or form. Or conversely, perhaps they can also be synergistic. Maybe we can learn valuable things on our jobs that can help us be a better parent or partner. Or maybe we learn valuable things in caring for other people that allows us to be better at work. Collectively, this is what we kind of refer to as the work-family interface, this idea that as adults, we have responsibilities to loved ones and to our careers and to our responsibility centers in the workplace. And trying to find that quote unquote balance is a challenge for just about everybody.
I'm really curious about this idea of work family enrichment. You kind of you mentioned it a moment ago in terms of the ways in which, in some ways, work can really benefit our family lives, and sometimes our family lives can really benefit work. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? What does that look like?
It looks in a variety of different ways, right? I mean, again, in today's, not to, I don't want to come across as a Marxist communist, but if we take a look at, sort of the capitalist view of, okay, we're a worker and a consumer, right? You can view that synergy as a form of work family enrichment, right? I go to work to earn a paycheck so that I can provide my family with the best living that I can. And in modern America, it works really well. In the Western world, it works really well because we do have some of the best quality of life in terms of access to various things. So that's a very concrete example of work family enrichment, is to the extent that I can be successful in the job market and earn a wage, a competitive wage, perhaps even a climbing wage. That's a form of work family enrichment because your family life is benefiting from the work that you're doing. But it can also happen at more of the social and the psychological levels. When I was in my doctoral program in human development and family science, I was learning all these advanced theories of child development and how to facilitate the best possible development for children in terms of early childhood education and theories of cognitive development. And it just so happened that my first son was born. So I was able to take that knowledge that I was acquiring through things that I hadn't had in school and apply them right then and there as my child was growing. That's an example of how we can learn things on a job. My job was to be a graduate student at the time. So we can learn things on a job and we can apply it in a very concrete sense. Just like a physician doesn't sweat whether or not their child has a temperature because they can do the differential diagnosis and say, yeah, nope, it's just a cold or it's just the flu. We don't have to sweat this. Or by contrast, most people who aren't a physician are like, oh, golly, is now the time to take my child into an emergency room? Again, that's another example of work family enrichment. Going back in the other direction, though, and this is really something that we've learned from, frankly, from the women's movement, and that is there's things about family life that are incredibly valuable in the workplace, right? We need to learn to understand that people have tantrums. And sometimes people have tantrums, and that's an incredibly important skill to work through. And as Sandra Day O'Connor would say, don't take the bait and just simply work through the drama of the moment without getting caught up in it, or managing multiple tasks, right? So there's many things that we can learn from our daily lives, either at work or at home, that spill over, that, come into that other domain that can be very beneficial for being successful and maybe even, gaining additional skills in that other domain. So those are the kinds of things that we mean when we talk about what is this thing that we call work family enrichment.
I'm curious about the impact of work family enrichment on things like psychological health and well-being, and physical health as well. I'm guessing that it's probably not all a good news story.
Well, it is not always a good news story, but again, the evidence seems pretty clear This is a domain of science that's only been around for maybe 10 or 15 years. And so we don't have the rich legacy of that particular science, but the associations are compelling. It appears as though people who have sort of this synergistic or enriching work and family life, that in fact they do have higher levels of well-being, right? And we're not just talking happiness, right? We're talking about people who've got a sense of, yeah, my life has purpose. I really play a role in today's society. I'm not just a cog in a wheel. That individuals who experience more of this work family enrichment, they have higher levels of well-being. They've got less, it's associated with less obesity, fewer chronic conditions, less hypertension and cortisol in terms of whether or not they're having a stressful day. So there seems to be some real compelling evidence to suggest that if we can make or facilitate ways for work and family to be synergistic in some meaningful way, it's good for individuals, it's good for workers, it's good for organizations, and it's good for society.
Are there big differences when you look at race or gender or sexuality or other kinds of forms of diversity?
Yeah, really good question. Those are areas that aren't really as unpacked as we'd like for them to be. I mean, at least with regard to gender, it seems pretty clear that women tend to experience more work-family enrichment than men. Perhaps that's a function of the role responsibilities that get thrust upon women, or conversely, the role responsibilities that get thrust on men that really force women or men to prioritize one or the other rather than trying to find this balancing act, if you will. There also seems to be some evidence that African Americans are actually better at this work family enrichment thing than whites or other racial or ethnic groups. But again, there's a lot of culture that's bound up in that. About 2 years or so ago, I went and I did some work over in Qatar. And as an Arab Islamic state, they're kind of where the United States was back in the 1970s. And what I mean by that is not to be diminutive, as much as they only have at best the current generation of working women to try to do this work family balance thing. So everybody wants work family balance, but traditions of, well, I'm supposed to spend X number of hours with my extended family on any given weekend, along with cleaning the house, along with doing my job, along with all these things. So tradition makes this balancing act hard because you're trying to combine, how do you put these two ideas together of work and family in a modern economy, but yet try to adhere to traditional ideas of what women and men should do. And so the connection back to the race and ethnicity thing is because African Americans have long had to do this balancing act longer than many traditional working and upper class white women and men, that perhaps they've got a skill set that's better able, or perhaps they've got more realistic expectations about how to actually pull off this work and family thing. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that particular space, but in some ways it works exactly the way that you would expect, right? That people who have practice being able to pull off work and family, to strive for things, but perhaps maybe not take their work or family too seriously, right? Looking for perfection, knowing that perfection may not exist, that those individuals tend to find a little bit more of that balance.
Makes me curious about cross-cultural differences around the relationship to work in general.
Mhm.
Are there interesting studies that are going on that are looking kind of comparatively across cultures around the world at this topic of kind of work in its relationship to things like work family interface?
The work stress literature has been engaged in cross-cultural research for a long time. And it's pretty clear that these ideas of control and demand and some of those other job characteristics that we talked about earlier, that those are, fairly universal, across cultural contexts. When people have control over the work, they tend to do better, regardless of whether they're in Japan, China, or the United States or South America. By contrast, if their work is really demanding, and especially if they don't have any control over it, they tend to do less well, no matter where you are in the world. By contrast, though, kind of this idea of what does it mean to sort of combine work and family? there are some very distinctive cultural differences. In the United States, for example, we've lived in what some people have called the segmented reality for, well, throughout the entire industrial era, right? That is, you go to work, you do your thing, you come home, you spend 8 hours a day being a worker, and then you spend the other 16 hours a day. Is my math right? The other 16 hours a day, 8 hours of doing sleep, and then 8 hours of consuming, essentially, right? So you relax, you watch TV, you putter in your garden, you do whatever else it is. The United States is fairly unique in sort of this, I'm either at work or at home. Other parts of the world tend to see work and family as a more integrated sort of a system. That is, I work for my family. One way of demonstrating my commitment to my family is through the work that I engage in. But nevertheless, that work is not so all consuming that I'm not able to, essentially, follow through on the rituals or the customs of what's expected in family life. Again, of course, there's substantial variation. Many of the Asian countries right now are sort of grappling with these excessively long work weeks. And part of that is, again, the challenge of how much do I need to work to be able to pay the rent so that I can buy the widgets, so that I can fill the cars, so that I can give my children the experiences that I want them to do. Some would argue that that's, sort of the fall of a little bit too much of a consumeristic or capitalistic sort of an orientation. But nevertheless, there does seem to be some cultural variation in sort of this, is work and family an integrative system, like in some parts of the world, or is it really segmented or, quote, separate spheres, unquote, like many people in the United States want to believe that it is? The science, by and large, seems to suggest that it is not separate spheres, but nevertheless, we tend to perpetuate the myth of separate spheres in the United States, and that myth seems to be growing around the world as more parts of the world take on sort of the way we approach things in terms of our work and the way that we kind of view the consumption of the products to make our lives, quote unquote, better.
Want to go in a slightly different direction. I know that some of the work that you've done has looked at the topic of alienation and its impact on kind of our health and well-being. Can you tell us a little bit about what that research has looked like?
Think of that assembly line worker who's, building clocks, and their job is to attach the door to the cuckoo clock, before it pops in and out and that sort of thing. And that's all that they see, right? All day long, they're just attaching that door to the front of the cuckoo clock. They don't see how the cuckoo clock is assembled on the front end. They don't have no idea what's happening to it once they put the door on it, apart from maybe seeing that clock in people's homes in some way, shape, or form. Alienation comes from that basic idea. That is, you're separated, alienated from the work that preceded putting that door on the cuckoo clock. You're also separated, alienated from the work that happens afterwards, how it gets put into a box, how it gets put on a truck, how it makes its way to a store, why people buy it in the first place. So you're alienated from all those other steps. But not only are you alienated from all those other steps, you're also alienated from the individuals that are doing each of those other steps, right? You're not actively engaged with those other people in the production of that cuckoo clock. By contrast, think about it in a different way today, where perhaps you and your family are going on a camping trip, and it's your job to set up the campsite, right? 2 or 3 people are working on setting up the tents. 2 or 3 people are going and getting the firewood. Somebody, perhaps is getting a fire going and perhaps getting a meal going. The point is everybody plays a part in getting the campsite set up. That's a much less alienating kind of a situation because we're all building towards something together, and we know what other people are doing, how they're contributing. Whether or not it's equal is not the point. I don't expect my 3-year-old to do the same amount of work as my, teenage son, or, and those kinds of things. But we're all contributing in sort of a meaningful way, and we understand how the pieces come together to create a coherent whole. all of those ideas together are in this concept of work alienation. So you're connected with other people or not. You're connected to the thing that you're doing and you see the outcome and why it's valuable or not. You see the utility or the beauty of the thing that you're building or not. All of that is bound up in this notion of alienation or alienated work. And again, the evidence is just beginning to emerge on that. It's been around for, at least, well, since the 1800s, so that we know that alienated work as a concept has been linked with a variety of mental health outcomes, think depression and those kinds of things. But only more recently have we started to connect it with some of the biology of successful aging, right? Things like stress hormones, things like, is your body experiencing some wear and tear on some of the organ systems that are at place? And that's some of the work that we had done with alienated labor and what's referred to as allostatic load, this idea that your body has some wear and tear on it, and it can show up in a thumbprint of how your body is behaving. So that's what you're referring to in that particular study, is where we found that people with higher levels of alienated work really show more wear and tear on their bodies at an organ level and at a tissue level than individuals who have a more connected, shall we say, kind of a workplace.
One of the reasons I'm so interested in this idea of alienation is because I think at some level, it is the opposite extreme from deeply meaningful work. I mean, so much of what makes work meaningful is a sense of significance and connection to what you're doing. Is there a purpose to my work? And in your description of the cuckoo clock, you're almost, that alienated moment is about removing any sense of larger purpose or meaning from the work that I did. The other thing that's so important to meaningful work is a sense of community and belonging. And again, the ideas of alienation are to a certain extent about eliminating those forms of interconnection that you might have between roles with potentially customers, interactions with other people, and so I think that it's an interesting way of framing the absence of meaning at work.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Your point is really well made, and of course it really points in the direction of at least two or three other things that we've already talked about here on this podcast, right? The first one is it's really easy for essentially knowledge workers, you and I, to be thinking about, oh yeah, that seems really important, right? Because we have the luxury of largely being able to engage with people, whether it's in a two-dimensional way like a Zoom call like this, or ideally in a three-dimensional way where there's actually people. But we tend to forget that there still are production facilities out there in the world. There still are assembly line kinds of things. We want to think that robots have taken all that stuff away, but the reality is it hasn't, right? There's still garbage trucks that go down the street and pick up garbage cans as though the street is a conveyor line. It's just now the workers are moving rather than the conveyor line is being moved, right? So the production line mentality is still alive and well. And those jobs are frequently housed by Black and brown individuals with less education, oftentimes people who are early in their career, so younger individuals. So there's still stratification to these forms of alienated labor, even in today's economy. But then the corresponding thing, fast forwarding to the future, is, well, okay, let's pretend that robots do take all the really bad, what some people refer to as 3D jobs, dirty, disgusting, and disgraceful jobs. Let's suppose robots do take all those things away, that robots do all the cleaning of toilets, that robots do all the evisceration of animals so that we can have our meat supply, that robots do all the harvesting of crops. Well, then what happens then to those workers? What do they do to be able to find meaningful work? Further, even for those folks in the knowledge economy, right? You and I are engaging right now in a two-dimensional interpersonal relationship, but that two-dimensional interpersonal relationship is not a 3D relationship. How do I know that you're not flipping me the bird underneath the camera where I can't see it? Can I have the same level of trust, Andrew, if I can't see your full body language and everything that you're doing, to know that, yeah, this is an authentic relationship that we are actually having in a two-dimensional space. Of course, these will be things that the future will unfold for us. Maybe virtual reality and the ability to see people in 3 dimensions and all that kind of stuff. Maybe that's going to change. But we do have to remember that as human beings and as social creatures, there is something to be said about being in the presence of other people that, at least at the moment, technology can't fix. And so all the way around this notion of connectedness and meaning and how do we recreate these things in a rapidly moving technological sphere is going to create challenges for health and well-being for society for a long time yet.
Is there anything that you think I should have asked you about the topic of meaningful work that we haven't yet that we haven't dove into?
The only thing that I would throw out, Andrew, that and I think it's sort of the challenge all the way around, and that is there's no such thing as perfect, right? So the pursuit of meaning can become a treadmill. It can become a hedonic treadmill, at least here in the United States, anyway, right? If one beer is good, three is better, kind of an arrangement, right? So likewise, okay, I think I found some meaning, but after a period of time, that meaning may no longer be satisfying in some way, shape, or form. And I do think that meaning in work is incredibly important, but I also can't help but wonder if there's a point of diminishing return. How much is the quest for meaning not unlike a quest for the perfect unicorn? I think, somewhere in the realm of talking about meaningful work, there also needs to be a discussion of contentment, or the idea of when is enough, or what can I expect out of my work, and maybe I'm expecting things out of my work that maybe I should be expecting in other places. And that's part of that work family balance part, right? Maybe rather than substituting interpersonal relationships at work because I don't have a good relationship at home, that's a good compensatory strategy, but in the long haul, is that a good strategy, right? Maybe there's some things to be said about there's a time and a place for our productive activities in the workplace and for our intimate activities at home or with the ones that we love. I think that's on the horizon as we think about what is meaningful work. How do we shape that to make sure that we don't essentially commodify meaningful work to turn in yet another hedonic pursuit that we're going after, that it then becomes this illusion or unicorn. I've gotten a little carried away, and I apologize for that, but I do think that is an important part of being able to think about how we understand work. Because at one point in history, work was a meaning-making element. It's yeah, I'm Joe the clock builder, and I make the best clocks in town, and people revel in the sound of my clocks and the accuracy of the time that it keeps, and it helps make society run. But if I just pursue that activity just because it makes me feel good, well, I may run out, and so I think we've got to balance that out in some way, shape, or form.
What a beautiful way of being able to wrap up this podcast and this conversation. Joe, your insights are truly expansive. I love the ways in which you are ultimately able to pull together all of this really interesting, rigorous science and the vast knowledge that you do have about the work that is being done within this field, and also tie together some of these bigger ethical concerns. I mean, meaningful work to what end? What are the ways in which ultimately we can live in more pro-social, in more eudaimonic worlds that allow us to really think through the whys of work and how we make work matter, period, whether it's through meaning or just being able to actually have work as a vehicle to live the rest of our lives.
Andrew, it's been great being with you today. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.